All right, so here is our final lecture for the summer. This is section 15, in which we talk about social media. So, when we talk about social media, most people think about apps, right? And social network sites, that's usually abbreviated SNS. But those are the apps that we're talking about. Of course, most of these they're not just apps, you find them on the web as well. So, how do these apps start? Or what is the process of a Facebook or a Twitter or Instagram or any of these social sites? What's the process of them becoming popular? How does that work? And they kind of work just like any new kind of technology works. There's this theory called diffusion of innovations. That was this kind of working theory was proposed by Everett Rogers, and it turns out it's more than just a theory. It's kind of an explanation of the natural way things occur in any kind of innovation of any kind of product that becomes popular. So this diffusion of innovations, it explains how and why new ideas or technologies spread. And diffusion, we may have talked about this in the past, but diffusion is the process by which an innovation is communicated or spread throughout a social system over time. So there's some stuff that's been done, like there was stuff on diffusion of innovations in VCRs, like when VCRs took off in America in the 80s, like how that occurred. And so you can really kind of apply that same process to almost any new technology or any new idea. And we'll follow through on this. What Rogers says is that diffusion of something depends on human capital, right? And there's different types of capital that we'll talk about, but most of the time when we say, how much capital does someone have, you're talking about, how much money they have, how many possessions, financially, how well off is someone. But the word capital just means, what you have, right? As opposed to losses, what you have that are considered assets. So when we talk about human capital, it's really talking about human assets, right? And by that I mean, how many friends do you have? How firm are those relations that you have? How are your relationships interconnected? And so Rogers is talking about this in terms of human capital, but if you think about it, it's very similar to what we would call social capital, right? So if human capital is do you have networks of people, right? And what types of networks of people do you have? Social capital just looks at, okay, well, how popular are you with these people, right? When you are engaged in a social event or activity, how are people viewing you? Do people tend to look at you? So at popularity and diffusion of social media messages rely on human capital, but it also relies on social capital. And so a better definition of social capital, instead of just saying how popular are you, is to say social capital is the networks of relationships among people who live and work in a particular society, enabling that society to function effectively. So it's not necessarily just looking at you and how many friends you have and what those relationships are like, but it's looking at, it's really looking at social networks, right? The friends that you have, do you have good relationships, strong relationships with them, but is that social network connected to some other social network? Give an example. We all have friends that we know through certain aspects of our lives. Let's say you have relationships you've developed through church, relationships you've developed through work. I have relationships developed from being active in Cub Scouts, right? So your social capital is really looking at how do all those networks interconnect, Do your religious friends interconnect with your work friends? Do they interconnect with your Cub Scout friends, or maybe you're in a sorority or a fraternity? So how do those networks kind of intermesh? Um, and how does that intermeshing, that interaction of networks help your society or your life function effectively, right? So we all have different degrees of capital, right? Human capital, which is looking more at resources. How many friends do you have? How many relationships do you have? What are those? What's the structure of those relationships? Social capital, again, is looking at what's the relationships between your relationships. How are all these things networked together? Um, and when I said something about social capital being popularity, if you think about it, social capital being it's a network of networks, that is popularity, right? If I go out on the street and this person says, hey, that's Kevin, hey, Kevin, and someone else says, hey, Kevin, and someone else says, hey, Kevin, it's because all these networks, are interrelated. Or someone will talk to somebody else and say, do you know Kevin Williams? Oh, yeah, I know Kevin Williams through Scouts. Do you know Kevin Williams? Yeah, I know Kevin Williams through the Episcopal Church. Do you know Kevin Williams? Yeah, I know Kevin Williams through his work at the university. All those relationships are now intermingling, and all those social worlds are kind of intermingling, and that relates to popularity, right? If everyone says, oh, I know Kevin, then Kevin must be a popular person, right? Cultural capital is this is the degree to which people believe you have the pulse of the current culture, right? So if we talk about pop culture, my friends, because I deal with media, right? Some of my older friends, whenever they do trivia contests, they'll say, well, let's get Kevin to come in because he can answer pop culture questions. Now, arguably, I'm much better at that when we consider the 80s pop culture, 90s pop culture, early 2000s as opposed to right now. Be hard pressed to kind of tell you exactly who the current hit makers are in music or whatnot. But I'm around young people all the time. So people tend to think that I do know, what the current culture is like. But that's cultural capital. Is when people say, oh, well, Kevin has his finger on the pulse of what's current and what's popular in culture. Political capital is just having the ability to know how to move an idea through political hurdles, right? If someone says, I'm a member, well, actually, but I'm a member myself of Faculty Senate, right? Which means that I help make and interpret academic policy at the university. So if someone has a problem in our department, most of the time they will come to me first and say, what do I need to do? And I'll tell them, well, you need to write a letter addressed to so-and-so talking about this relationship, and I'll tell them, here's what you need to put in the letter, here's what you don't want to put in the letter. If you put this in the letter, the Faculty Senate is going to say this is not our issue, and they're going to pass it off to somebody else. But if you frame it this way, they'll adopt it and they'll put a task force or some committee on this issue to look at further. Or they'll say, Kevin, who do I need to talk to try to convince that the way we do advising is perhaps wrong? And I will tell them, well, you need to speak to so-and-so. But if you go to so-and-so and just complain that we're doing something wrong, it won't work. You have to approach it in this manner. That's because I have, on campus at least, political capital, right? I kind of know what you have to do in order to get an idea or some new kind of project pushed through the politics of the bureaucracy. I kind of understand that a little bit better. than average faculty, I would say. It's because I've been on Faculty Senate for 5 years. So Roger says if we break this down, what we actually get are categories of adopters. Okay, and so he'll first call these people innovators, the first ones to adopt something, right? And by adopt something, I just mean to, let's say that we're creating a new social media app. So the innovators are the ones that are the first to kind of take part in it, right? That's what I mean by adopters, when you start taking part in something. So innovators take risks. They usually have high social status, and they usually can economically absorb failures. So even if it's not something like a social media site, but let's say it's a new car, right? Like a new electric car to rival the Tesla comes on market. Innovators typically have, let's say someone decides, ooh, I just heard about this new car, I'm going to buy it. Well, that's because economically they can absorb failures, right? If you are strapped for cash and you go out and buy a car that ends up not being worth a flip, right, and you waste $80,000 to $90,000 on it, you don't get to take those risks anymore very often because you have spent yourself into bankruptcy. So usually we see richer people that are the innovators, or people that have more fluid cash, let's put it that way, which tends to mean they have higher social status, right? Then we see early adopters, and the early adopters have the highest degree of opinion leadership. So, you may have an innovator out there that is taking risks, that is investing in this thing and it flops. They invest in a second thing, it flops. They invest in a third thing, huge payoff, right? It gives them a lot of payoff. But then the fourth, fifth thing that they invest in, it fails again. So while they are risky and while they may have high social status, they're not necessarily known as always making the right decision, right? Early adopters, in comparison, usually are viewed as making, more often than not, the best choices, right? So they have the highest degree of opinion leadership, as opposed to saying, well, Kevin makes risks all the time or takes risks all the time, and so let's just see how things pan out before we decide to get a car too. An early adopter, people are going to say, ooh, Kevin got one. Now we need to think, because if Kevin got it, it must be a pretty good product. So these people are viewed as making judicious choices, right? That they use good judgment when they make choices. And that these people are respected for their foresight. They see things in advance. They see this thing is going to be good and it's going to take off and it's going to be popular, right? So those are the early adopters. Then the next group would be the early majority. So this is when people say, oh, look, I know this innovator, this risky guy, and he took a risk on it. But then I've also noticed that some of these other people that usually are pretty right about how successful this product is going to be, we've noticed a lot of those buying it too. So we think it's time to jump in, right? And so this is the early majority. They have above average social status, right? But they're low on opinion leadership. No one's really looking to them and saying, oh, well, since they did it, it must be good. You may have people that want to keep up with the Joneses. So you may have people that say, oh, well, so-and-so and so-and-so bought it, so we need to buy it too. But that's a little bit different than opinion leadership. They're not, let's say this, that the Smiths, will come up with that name. The Smiths buy this car. Well, the Joneses, they see the Smiths and they say, well, if they've got the car, we need it too. And then another family looks at the Joneses and says, well, if the Joneses have it, then we need to have it. We need to keep up with what everybody else is doing. And then you have late majority. So these are the people that have seen that this thing has gone popular and it's gone successful, but they were skeptical for a long time. They usually don't have high social status. They're usually lower in social status, and they will adopt something, but it will be late in the game, right? And then you have laggards, who are the last to adopt. They have little or no opinion leadership, and they don't like change, right? So it's well, why do I want that? There's no reason for me to have that. I don't need an electric car, right? I'm happy with what I got. Why do y'all want to change and force me to get an electric car? Those are the laggards. So what type of issues do we have with social media? And really trying to look at the psychology of social media. When first introduced to social media, people feel excited and motivated to deepen their relationships. It opens them up. You know, I can remember my mother, who is 79 right now. She was very late to the game with Facebook. She may have only started like 3 or 4 years ago. And when she saw it, she just thought, oh, okay, she got it, finally. You know, she's definitely a laggard in terms of new technologies. Definitely a laggard. But once she did adopt Facebook, let's say, and an iPad so she could look at Facebook, which I think is primarily what she uses her iPad for, she got it once she got involved with it. She was like, oh, I can keep up with so-and-so, and I can see what so-and-so's doing, and you know, I can tell them that I like this, or comment when they have a question. So she really did see it as deepening her relationships and reconnecting her with older relationships that she had. And I think that's what most people see when they get into it. I mean, it's the exact same thing for my daughter, who's 14, and why she started to get into Facebook and more with her on Instagram, right? But we all know that may be how it starts, but then all hell breaks loose, and Facebook turns into something else entirely. And not just trying to pick on Facebook. It's just Facebook is no pun intended, it's the face of social media. So what hath Facebook wrought? And it's kind of the same for Twitter or Instagram or any of these things, but we do have research that says people who've used Facebook for the longest amount of time are more likely to agree that others were happier and had better lives. So think about what we're doing here with Facebook. We're using Facebook not just to catch up with other people's lives, but we use it self-reflectively in that we use it to judge our own lives, right? So we look at what's other people doing, and then you compare that to yourself and make a judgment. Also found that those who had lots of Facebook friends are people that you don't really know, but you friended them on Facebook, so they're in your social network, but you're not really that good of friends. You know, I like to say it's the grocery store test, right? Which is, you may be Facebook friends, but if you pass each other in a grocery store and you don't say hello and stop to chat, are you really friends, or are you just Facebook friends? So those with Facebook friends that they don't really know, those with the most, agreed more that others had better lives. So the more Facebook friends you have, which is to say you don't have a strong relationship with those people, but the more of them you have, you tend to judge yourself more, right? It kind of makes sense. If I have a very, very close friend and we're connected on Facebook and I see what they're doing, I know about that friend too. I know that, you know, they're posting these pictures of their happy lives, but they're also not telling you that their marriage is about to end. You know that divorce is coming. You know that the picture where they're, laughing and playing with their children, ooh, those children have pretty heavy behavior disorders. They're a handful, right? So you can make better judgments about the reality of their lives. Whereas if you're just Facebook friends, you don't know that reality. All you're seeing is the happy bright spots, right? Also, feeling excluded from one's social connections has been seen to lead to decreases in psychological well-being. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll go onto Facebook and they say, oh, look, Kathy and Susan went out to eat tonight, and then they went to see a movie. I wonder why they didn't call me. And all of a sudden you feel excluded, and you start feeling worse about yourself. Well, what's wrong with me that they don't ever want to ask me to be a part of this? Some of this stuff is called online vulnerability. It's the capacity to experience detriments to one's psychological, reputational, or physical well-being as a result of the experiences that you encounter in online activities. So, some people, and what we're talking about is like a person's own level of online vulnerability. In other words, some people might see Kathy and Sue go into a movie and say, oh, look, Kathy and Sue went to go see so-and-so, and it looks like they had a great time. How good for them. Another person may look at it like we just talked and say, well, why didn't they invite me? And so the person who's questioning why they didn't get invited, they have more online vulnerability than the person who just looked at it and passed it off as, oh, that's nice that these two good friends got to spend some time together. So that's what online vulnerability is your capacity to experience detriments, right? How likely are you to experience detriments? Online practices, including self-disclosure and the accumulation of large, unmanageable online networks, have been seen as contributing to online vulnerability. So if you're constantly self-disclosing, or if you have a large social network, but it's primarily because of Facebook friends, not true friends, a lot of times you're contributing to your own online vulnerability. Why? Well, we just talked about the Facebook friends aspect. If you have a large network of those, then you're always seeing people at their best, not at their worst. You don't know anything about their real lives. And so you're surrounding yourselves with people that you're judging to have just fantastic lives, probably better than yours, right? Also, the people who self-disclose a lot, right? We all know those people on Facebook who are just putting themselves out again and again and again online, right? Oh, I had such a terrible today. I had such a terrible day today. My friends don't care about me. They don't really take care of me. I was let down by this person, blah, blah, blah. Those people tend to have more online vulnerability too, obviously. We see that increases in social network site use leads to increases in online vulnerability. That makes sense. So the more that you're online looking at things, the more likely you are to be vulnerable, which in turn leads to decreases in self-esteem, right? So if you stay online more and you get your feelings hurt more, then guess what? Your self-esteem decreases. That's kind of a no-brainer. There's this other aspect called fear of missing out. So what is that? Fear of missing out, which sometimes people will just call FOMO. FOMO is this pervasive apprehension that others might be having rewarding experiences and you've been left out, right? So FOMO is most definitely looking at, oh, Kathy and Sue went to the movies and no one asked me. You don't want to miss out on things. It's characterized by this desire to stay continually connected with what others are doing. So FOMO is this kind of apprehension that other people are having rewarding experiences. But it's also this fear. I mean, it's very, the name hits it right on the head. You have this fear that if you're not connected to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, if you're not connected continually, you're going to miss something important. You know, someone's going to say, "Oh, did you see that video about so and so?" No, I didn't. And so you go online, and turns out you don't want to be the person left out of the loop. You don't want to be, you don't want to be the person that constantly is saying, "No, what do you mean?" You want to be in the know, right? You want to know what's going on. We've seen that increased SNS use leads to increased levels of FOMO. And increases in FOMO correspond to increases in network size, profile data, and emotional disclosure. So it's a lot like online vulnerability. FOMO is the same thing. Well, I'm afraid that I'm going to miss something, right? And the more your network grows, the more you fear you're going to miss out on something. The more that you update your profile, you know, leave status updates and whatnot, that's probably because you're on Facebook more and you're afraid, since you're on Facebook more, that you may miss out on something. And emotional disclosure, if you're always telling somebody way too much stuff about yourself, it's probably because you're on Facebook more, and that means you probably have more FOMO, right? So, individuals rating low in efficacy. So, efficacy is how you view your own effectiveness, right? So, your efficacy is your ability to see yourself being effective in some way, right? So we talk about maybe it's, I'm doing a research project on video games. So let's say video game efficacy. That's the belief of how good you are at being successful in video games. Or academic efficacy, how good you are at achieving the grades that you want to achieve, right? So individuals rating low in efficacy, autonomy, and connectedness report higher levels of FOMO. So if you think, well, I'm not very effective, I don't really like to be on my own too much, right? But I actually don't have that many friends. That person has higher FOMO. Individuals experiencing deficits in social needs as a result of FOMO might be more likely to seek out increased social capital through the accumulation of larger online networks. So what we're going to see is that FOMO is kind of a vicious cycle, right? I go online, I get more friends because I have this detriment to efficacy, autonomy, and connectedness, right? And so I go online and I build that network. And that network just, as that network gets bigger, it just increases the amount of FOMO that I have. And that amount of FOMO, as it increases, is going to drive me to make my network even bigger, which is again going to create more judgments about yourself, right? The more people you add, the more people you're looking at, and that means you judge yourself more. What about narcissism? Narcissism is something that we talk about as a result of increased social network use, right? You start thinking about yourself more. A highly inflated, grandiose, and positive but unrealistic self-concept. Okay, this is narcissism. It's strongly related to online self-presentation and promotion. If you're always presenting yourself and promoting yourself on Facebook, telling people, oh, here I am at this, here I am at that, here I am here, and isn't my life so great? That's narcissism. and it's positively related to addictive use of social media. How many times have you ever gone on someone's profile on social media and seen that they just post selfies over and over and over and over again? You sit there and you think they must, first of all, really think a lot of themselves, which is narcissism, but they also seem to be on Facebook or Instagram all the time. They're constantly adding pictures of themselves. Research argues that individuals who post selfies, there you go, are more likely to be perceived by others as narcissistic. In 2016, it's estimated that 93 million selfies were taken worldwide each day. Also, 1,000 selfies were posted to Instagram every 10 seconds. And compared to men, women post twice as many selfies on social media and are more likely to post selfies of all types. Right? So, we are seeing narcissism increase as a result of social media use. And so people are thinking that maybe this is getting to a point where we should consider social media an addiction. That some people just stay on it all the time and they can't get off of it. So here are some instances of addiction characteristics that instead of being addicted to drugs, what we've done is we've replaced drugs with social media. And so we look at questions such as, are you preoccupied by social media? Which is an issue of salience, like how often are you thinking about it? Do you use social media in order to reduce negative feelings? This is mood modification. So if you think about it, again, you could say all this about drugs. Are you preoccupied by drugs? Are you always thinking about drugs? Do you use drugs to reduce bad feelings you have? Are you gradually using social media more and more in order to get the same pleasure from it? In other words, tolerance or craving. Do you find that, you used to be able to go into social media for 5-10 minutes and you really enjoyed that time, and now you're looking at yourself and saying, instead of 5-10 minutes, now I'm spending an hour at a time just combing through Facebook, and yeah, it is interesting, but it's not as interesting as it was in the beginning. Are you suffering distress if you have been prohibited from using social media? So you're experiencing withdrawal. If you go out in the woods and you have no cell phone signal, or you're in, an aluminum building and your signal is not working, do you feel anxious? Do you feel like you're having withdrawal symptoms? Are you sacrificing other obligations and are causing harm to other important areas of your life because of social media use? I was going to go to church, but I ended up spending all this time on Twitter. Or I was going to go and volunteer to help at this shelter, but I ended up just sitting around on Facebook. I was going to study for my exam, but I just spent way too much time on Instagram. Are you desiring or attempting to control the use of social media without success? So have you several times said, okay, well, I'm just going to get off social media. I'm just going to quit. I'm just not even going to go visit that. And then a week later, you realize, crap, I'm back on here again. I thought I was not going to do this. And, have you had these loss of control episodes or relapse episodes? Finally, who's most likely to be addicted? We see social media addiction is more prevalent in the younger rather than the older people, and women rather than in men. Those lower in self-esteem. Again, we're kind of talking about low self-esteem driving online vulnerability and driving FOMO. And the drive in that just increases your use of the site. So, um, that makes sense. That since you use it more, you will become addicted to it. Also, people with low self-esteem regard social media as a safer place to express themselves. So again, it's a vicious cycle. You have people with low self-esteem. They're high in online vulnerability, high in FOMO, but they don't like to go out and take chances with themselves. They don't like to put themselves out there. So it's safer to them to go online. There's a lot of people that you probably know from Facebook or Twitter or Instagram that you really kind of think they're a social butterfly. They really don't talk that much. They just seem socially awkward. But then you see them on Facebook and you're like, oh, this person's funny, or this person, we have a lot of similar interests. You know, I kind of like them on Facebook, but then you get around them in real life and you're just like, no, this person's is awkward. Sometimes people with low self-esteem operate better online than presenting in reality, right? So that is the end of what I have for you today. I will see you in class.